Introduce Michael Curri, the next speaker, who, if he's smart, is sweating a little bit because he knows me. Michael and I have had a long, good relationship, challenging each other in that I've not always agreed with what he said, but I've always learned in engaging him. He runs the Strategic Networks Group, which does a lot of analysis of what he'll call utilization, but he'll say it in a Canadian accent, which is how to get the benefits out of networks. I talk a lot about how to build infrastructure. Michael talks about how to make sure you're using it really well, and I think he's a really sharp mind on this subject. So welcome to the stage, Michael.
Great. Thanks very much, Chris. Welcome, everyone. It's good to be here. I have to say it's been a journey to get here, not just yesterday, but over the last 8 months, having been introduced to Bruce and been working with him. We look at the economic impacts of broadband and what does it mean to a community. We invest in this. I think Glenn mentioned, the payoff. It's the payoff that we look at, we measure. As an economist, I look at this as there's the demand side of broadband, how we use it, how does it benefit our community, the businesses, the quality of life. There's the supply side of broadband, which is the engineering. A lot of technical things need to get this in place, which is a big challenge. So I think the fundamental question, though, is how do we pay for this, especially with limited budgets, as somebody mentioned earlier today. And this journey started for me, as I said, 8 months ago when I was asked to present and discuss the last mile gaps, the rural areas not getting connected, and for one of the state broadband advisory councils. And in that process, I was introduced to Bruce, and we started talking about what happened, and we started measuring this Ammon story. And so I'll tell that story and what the findings of that were. But I want to first, get into, the same playing field as everyone. I think everyone is on the same page here. But really, why are we building networks? Because without broadband, how can you actually improve local business competitiveness, innovation, and growth, retain, expand, or even attract businesses, enhance that quality of life for those people, especially with smart city services and household incomes, and enable those smart city services, and frankly, survive? This is an essential to those quality jobs, good-paying local jobs. And those things are not on what I call the business case of those internet service providers. I differentiate between the business case of the provider. The revenues have to be greater than the capital expenditures and the operational expenditures of the business case. If they're not, there's no case to invest. And then we see unserved and underserved areas. But we know, just like the previous discussions, that broadband is like another utility. If you don't have good roads, clean water, reliable electricity, how can your community retain those businesses, even attract those businesses? The same with broadband. And there are some significant benefits to the community that far outweigh those network profits. And that's why we see communities getting involved to bridge that gap so that those rural areas, those areas that are high cost, low margin, even in urban areas, get service. The challenge is, when you start getting into local ownership of broadband, there's a number of questions. One, resistance by the incumbents. Hey, this is encroaching on what we're doing, and there's a strong resistance around that. There's a lot of expertise and capacity that is needed to make this happen. Do we have those resources locally? In the case of Ammon here and some other communities that are leaders, they had it and they were able to make it a success. A lot of communities just don't have that. How do we finance this, especially in limited budgets? And then the taxpayer resistance. For those that don't understand it or don't see the value in this, well, there's going to be resistance. And I've worked with projects where there's been that taxpayer pushback, the ratepayer pushback, and it stopped the projects. And that's a real shame because we know what the impacts are. We measure those. The answers, well, that's part of the discussion today. And until now, there really haven't been, a lot of compelling answers to make this happen. But I think here in Ammon, we have a really interesting approach that can be replicated. And I think it can be considered a future model for a number of communities. So, just some background. We've done this work for a number of states, communities, and regions, and also the incumbents. We measure what that demand is, and I've been doing this actually for 22 years. And with that, I want to get into some of the numbers, because we want to show, as I said, those demand drivers, what is causing this. And what's really interesting about the work we did with Bruce was that, the $1 million that was invested in the network, over 25 years, the net return is positive $821,000. So the municipal cost reductions paid for the network. We can do this. That's for the backbone for all those municipal facilities. There are other components to that economic feasibility. And by the way, that report, there's a link to it at the bottom, and I'll be around later on for some questions if anyone has some questions during the panel, the roundtables. That pays for it. That covers it. Well, there's some other aspects to that economic case that we call. There's the subscriber benefits, which are those households that are now paying less for better broadband. And from our calculations, that represents $35 million over 25 years. What does that represent in the additional spending within the community? Or even attracting people to come here because, hey, we can do all we want and have really affordable and good access. There's also the economic benefits of the businesses now having access. And we've got over 70,000 records in our database on how individual businesses, households, and organizations are connected, using, and benefiting from the internet connection that they have. And from our analysis, that represents almost $72,000 per business in additional revenues. And that has almost, just over $4.5 million in annual additional revenues to businesses in Ammon that are connected. That's pretty significant. So, broadband is strategic infrastructure. It's, as has been discussed, it's a utility. It's an essential service for a community. The question that I have is, although roads were the industrial infrastructure, and it costs $2 to $10 million to build a mile of road, there's a real challenge when we get into dealing with fiber, which is about $100,000 to build. It is the infrastructure for the digital economy, but how come there's such a challenge to get people convinced on it? And the reason is they don't understand what those benefits are. Chris, in his previous presentation, just mentioned, those benefits are often realized further down the road if they're measured. You can see them. What we would try to do is help tell that story about what those benefits are. There's hard benefits, revenues, cost savings, new jobs. There's also quality of life benefits, community vitality. We also get into that. But that's the key challenge. And for those cities that get it and they're investing, we just did a study that was released last month. Cities across the U.S. And how are they dealing with broadband? And one of the questions was how are they financing it? And you see that list if you can read it. There's the report. This presentation will be available later. But government bonds, subscriptions, and then bond funding and taxes below that. The challenge is there isn't much government funding available at the federal level or state level anymore. There's a stimulus that happened, but that ended last year. In terms of the subscription revenues, well, that's the business case of those incumbents. And if you're thinking you're coming in after those incumbents who've already chosen those, those more profitable areas, you're dealing with high cost, low margin areas to be covered. How are you going to make a business case when those incumbent providers, which is their business, say, no, this isn't a business case for us? And then taxes. Who is agreeing to having their taxes increased? So really, how do you finance this? We all know it's good. We all know it's important. More and more people are realizing that. But how do we make this work? And that's where we get into building that economic case for broadband, which is looking at not just those network margins, but also how are we, municipal cost reductions, subscriber savings, economic growth, quality of life benefits. When you add those all together, that makes an economic case for investing, a pretty strong economic case for investing, as the work in Ammon showed. I think one of the key things you need to first focus on is, what needs to be done beforehand. And Chris, again, touched on that. But it can be low risk and sustainable, but it requires a pivot in approach. That these underserved and unserved areas, that's not a business case for providers. And a pivot is needed so that this is looked on as an essential service, just like good roads, reliable electricity, and clean water. And so the challenges that can and need to be overcome are building that community support, growing that political will, where to find that funding that is hiding in plain sight. Those municipal cost reductions, as we showed, pay for the network. And then you add on all those other benefits to make this make sense. How to accurately assess and drive demand. And when I say drive demand, from our analysis at S&G, like I said, we've got over 70,000 businesses, organizations, households in our database. For the businesses that are connected, over 70% are underutilizing that internet connection that they have, which means they're not taking advantage of reaching those new customers or working with partners to take advantage of it. That's an awareness and education and training campaign that is missing. I think community colleges play a real significant role in helping get affordable support, technical support, to help the small and medium-sized businesses, which are the backbone of the economy, to help them understand, what, you should get on social media and be selling online and so forth. Because it's not just about being competitive. If you're not online, you're irrelevant because people can't find you. And that's the challenge, and especially for rural area, these small businesses need that help. And finally, that economic feasibility. And this is different from the business feasibility that's traditionally done. Economic feasibility looks at that investment over 20, 25 years, just like roads, just like water system, just like electrification. And so start with that economic feasibility. Can we pay for this? And if the benefits do outweigh the costs, then the community leaders can make a decision to take this essential service approach. That is a significant pivot. Aggregate that demand by neighborhood, because then with that you have the economic case and you've got committed demand. It's not build it and they will come. No, these people have already signed up, as has happened with Bruce's approach in the broadband improvement districts. And then you can take the next steps to provide that affordable, ubiquitous fiber. I mean, we are technology agnostic and vendor neutral, but there are certain limitations with the technology. And when you can go for that technology that enables all those things and is future-proof, and you can cover those costs because the benefits far outweigh it, then it makes sense to invest. And finally, can your community approach broadband as that infrastructure platform? And again, up front, when you know that the benefits outweigh the costs, well, then let's figure out a way now to make it happen. So the challenges that I've listed at the beginning of the presentation, well, we have some of those answers, and Ammon has been a great example of how to address those. Build infrastructure as a platform. Do what the city, the region, what government is good at, building infrastructure. Allow open competition. Outsource the network build and operation. Deploy based on that committed demand, and don't implicate the taxpayers. This broadband improvement districts where people, yes, we're going to opt in, we're going to pay for that. It's a much more efficient way, in the end, I can discuss that later, but it's a much more efficient way to pay for it. So we've provided some resources. There's a link to some of the resources. There's the Ammon report and a paper that talks about that journey that, over the last 8 months that was published in Broadband Communities magazine that are available. And I'll make this presentation available as well. With that, thank you.